Fabulous. It looks like we've got a really good number of people who've managed to join us. So I'm really delighted to welcome you today to our session on governance trends, what's changing and why it matters, which we're thrilled to be co-hosting with Zurich. Um, we're looking forward to taking some time together to run through our report, look at the detail of that, and then have some time for questions at the end. But before we get into that, a couple of little housekeeping things I'm sure you'd expect. We've just got an hour-long session today, so we won't be having any kind of formal break. Do, of course, take breaks as you need. If you need to get someone's attention, you can do so in the chat. And I've got a number of colleagues here with me who can answer any technical questions that you have. And we'll also be sharing things like links and signposting to resources as we go. If, as we're speaking, you do have a question for us, please use the Q&A function today, and we'll have an opportunity, as I say, to look at your questions in more detail later on in the session. If you can please keep yourself on mute unless we invite you to unmute. And we are recording today so that you're aware. I think those are probably the key things. Oh, I should say we do have closed captions as well, which are enabled. You can turn those on and off by clicking the closed captions icon that's in your toolbar. If you have any other technical questions, then please just get in touch with us using the chat, and one of my colleagues will be able to help you. So, what are we going to spend our next hour looking at? Well, really, our session today is looking at our understanding of trends in charity governance. And while we've said 2025, and it's, of course, Trustees Week 2025 right now, these trends have been taken from work we've done over the last 3 years. So we're really able to examine how things have changed, where we see real strengths and where there are opportunities. I'll take some time at the start of our session to run through the report itself, which you should all have been sent in advance, and to pull out some of the key themes that we've spotted in terms of those trends. I'll then pass to my colleague Jesper, who's going to do a bit of a deep dive on the question of alignment of our governance teams. And when we talk about a governance team, we're talking here about those people who make up your board of trustees, your governing body, your council, whatever you call that senior decision-making group. And then those people who you might have as a staff team, maybe senior volunteers if you don't have any paid staff, but all of the people who are part of the ecosystem contributing to delivering governance in your organisation. And we'll be looking at what happens if that group gets misaligned with one another and what that can mean for how you manage risk as an organisation, recognising that one of the aspects of good governance is that it's a risk management tool. We'll finish off our session today with an opportunity for you to ask us any questions that you have. And again, I'd really encourage you to use that Q&A function for any questions which come up for you as we're speaking. So before I dive into the report itself, it's probably important for me to say who I am and who we are. So my name's Sally, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the lead governance consultant here at NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. We are a national infrastructure body, we're a charity ourselves, and we are a membership organisation with over 17,000 members, charities from right across the length and breadth of the country and the sector. So we support everyone from tiny village cricket clubs right through to international development, global aid, big medical research charities, and absolutely everyone in between. And that puts us in a fantastic position to share sessions like this, where we look into what is happening across the world of charities. As a governance consultant, I work with hundreds of charities each year, whether that is training trustees, working with senior leaders, or delivering governance reviews. And our report that we've looked at and created that we're examining today is drawn from a series of those governance reviews that we've conducted with organisations over the last 3 years. So the report itself is built from the feedback of over 800 participants from across 70 different organisations. These are all organisations that had a facilitated governance review with NCVO. So not just organisations doing a continuous improvement piece of work, but those charities who decided to take a step further, do a full external review with one of my team supporting them to go through that process. This is something that we'd recommend that every charity does every 3 years, just to have that external assurance that your governance is performing in the way that you'd hope. The way that we deliver those governance reviews is an assessment against the Charity Governance Code. So when you see CGC anywhere in my presentation, that is the Charity Governance Code, and that's a model for good governance in the sector. And the assessments that we talk about in this report were all against the 2020 version of the Charity Governance Code. An exciting thing that's happened this Trustees Week is that we've just published the new version of the Charity Governance Code. So that was released last Friday and it's available online to download now. And later in the presentation, I'll talk you through the small changes that we've seen, but big impact that they're going to have in terms of the code and how it can be used by charities. The Charity Governance Code doesn't belong to NCVO, we just use it as the basis for our assessments, but it's in fact a cross-sector tool, so it's developed and designed through consultation with lots of different organisations and then through a cross-sector voluntary steering group. So it has that independence and it really is designed to be a tool for the sector by the sector. And we use that as the basis for our governance wheel tool. This is a self-assessment, self-improvement mechanism. So any of our members can access that tool for free and you can use it with your board today if you wanted to. But we also use it as the basis for our facilitated exercises that we do within our consultancy team. So that's how we developed this set of data, speaking to 70 different organisations, having them use our tool to assess themselves against the Charity Governance Code. And that feedback came from 800 participants, many of whom were trustees, some of whom were staff members of those organisations. And together, they shared with us their perceptions of how governance was working and the effectiveness of governance practices and processes in their organisation. It's important to say this is a self-perception tool that we're talking about, so it relies on those people in the governance team really understanding their own governance and really being able to freely and honestly share their experience in the organisation. And broadly speaking, that is what we find happens when we do this work with charities. A couple of highlights really stood out to us in the kind of overall picture of the report. Firstly, of the 8 different principles that we have in the Charity Governance Code, there was really high confidence in integrity as a principle. It scored most highly across most of the assessments and exercises that we did, with participants commenting that they felt that their organisations were working with high level of integrity and that the decisions were backed by that principle. And the other highlight was that, broadly speaking, organisations did feel that decision making was strong in their organisation. Within the report, we did also see a couple of key risks emerging. And those really were the recognition that we still have a way to go as a sector in terms of really embedding EDI practice. EDI stands for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And that is, again, one of the 8 principles of the Charity Governance Code. And that area had the lowest level of confidence across our participants. And consistently we heard comments through these exercises that organisations felt they might only just be starting on that journey and really wanted to do more to ensure that those inclusive practices and a reflection of the diversity of our communities was part of their work as a charity. We also identified that there's a risk around alignment within that governance team. So whether or not the perceptions from our staff colleagues and our trustees are similar to one another, how well they align. So that's a brief overview how we constructed the report and key themes. As I've mentioned, the report is very much based around making use of 2 tools. The 2020 version of the Charity Governance Code, with its 8 principles, the foundational principle around what it means to be a trustee, the principle around organisational purpose, what direction we're taking our organisations, what strategic framework we have to inform that. Principle around leadership. How do we act as leaders? How do we work as leaders? And what values do we bring to the organisation? That strong area of integrity. How do our decisions reflect ethical practice and engage in a strong cultural model which ensures that everyone in our organisation is safe? Decision-making, risk and control. How do we effectively manage the checks and balances that we have in our organisations to ensure that where we make decisions, they're effective and that they're well managed within our ecosystem? Board effectiveness. How do we as trustees interact with one another effectively? How do we construct our board so that we have the right people making the right decisions in the right way, so that we're hearing from the voice we need to hear from? That principle around equality, diversity and inclusion, EDI. How are we ensuring that we are inclusive and that we're making use of the diverse range of perspectives that we know creates good decision making? And openness and accountability. How are we sharing transparently what we do in governance to ensure that our organisations are not only innovating and moving forward, but they're doing so with our stakeholders well informed? As I mentioned, we take those principles of the Charity Governance Code, and these are the basis, the wheel tool, which is part of our assessments, where we invite participants to score their self-perception of confidence in each of these areas on a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being we feel significantly at risk and we think that there are areas where we are simply not performing against this part of governance, right through to a score of 10, we are outperforming expectations and a model for the sector. So each of those 800 plus participants looked at this wheel tool and gave a reflection of their personal perception of their organisation's governance based on these 1 to 10 scales, which gave us our data. So in more depth, what did that data really tell us? Well, this is our overall result. We take that wheel model and we create a lovely radar chart based on the mean average scores for each of our Charity Governance Code principles. And as you might expect for such a large sample size and such a diverse range of charities that we were looking at, 70 organisations over the course of 3 years, we fall at a relatively average place in terms of the overall results, with our scores striking somewhere between a 6 and a 7 in most cases, which we describe as somewhere between getting a grip with these areas of governance and feeling quite competent. A notable thing for us was that over time, we did see organisations increase slightly in their level of confidence across these principles. And that demonstrates to us as part of these exercises how strong a continuous improvement tool the Charity Governance Code can be. So while our overall average scores sit around this kind of 7 mark across all principles, with a couple, equality, diversity and inclusion and board effectiveness, falling slightly lower, and a couple, such as integrity and decision-making, risk and control, being slightly higher, you'll notice that if we just isolate the results from our most recent exercises in 2025, there we are, our scores improve slightly. So actually, those organisations that have assessed themselves regularly over the time that the codes existed, so since 2020, they are growing in confidence. And we're seeing trustees and staff members, everyone who's part of that governance team, feeling that they perceive their governance to be at a stronger level than it might have been a few years ago, which is really fantastic to see. That doesn't mean to say that we didn't also hear some really clear themes around opportunities in governance as part of these exercises. And the types of things that came through the feedback were that it's important for our organisations to be looking beyond just financial risk when considering that decision-making, risk and control area, recognising that there are a range of different risk areas which are part of governance and need to be properly supervised and overseen by our boards and senior teams. So we saw regularly that organisations were reflecting positively on their decision-making, but looking for some greater monitoring of wider risk areas. We also saw that a lot of organisations were struggling to get their board size and shape quite right. So thinking about how do we intelligently construct our boards, making sure that we are benefiting from the diversity of different voices we might like to hear. So whether that is diversity of skills, background, lived experience, that we have the right voices in the room without becoming cumbersome, without having too many people involved. And also while making sure that we have the right credibility with our stakeholders. So whether that is getting the mix right between having elected and appointed trustees, so that we achieve the right type of skills, but also reflect the needs of our membership if we have one. So lots of organisations really thinking in terms of board effectiveness, are we getting our board size and shape right here? We saw that lots of organisations felt confident in how they were structuring their governance, but they didn't necessarily have that set out on paper. And so a lot of our recommendations through our exercises were around making sure that there are clearly codified role descriptions, codes of conduct, and induction materials that set out the terms for the governance team, making sure that everyone is clear on the role and responsibilities of trustees, of senior staff, how they interact with one another in a way that's constructive and healthy. When thinking about that area of openness and accountability, we heard quite a lot of feedback around the steps that charities are taking to better centre beneficiaries, those people that we are seeking to serve in the work that we do, and improving overall stakeholder engagement and the transparency of decision making. Now, we recognise that at senior level, we can't always share every single decision we make or the rationale behind it. Sometimes things are confidential and they have to be so. But there's certainly some progress that can be made and an opportunity that can be capitalised on in our organisations around bringing our community, whether that's our beneficiaries, our wider stakeholders, our members, even our staff, on that journey of change with us. As I've already mentioned, and as you will have seen through the graph that I just showed, that question of EDI remained an area of lower confidence across all of the organisations that we looked at, or certainly many of them. And so a real opportunity continues to be, how do we embed those practices of equality, diversity and inclusion in our organisations as part of our wider values and culture framework? And then finally, when we think about board effectiveness, as well as decision-making, risk and control, and leadership, so a number of different principles, we heard feedback that boards need to focus on staying strategic. And this links really well to this question of having clearly codified role descriptions and understanding who does what in our governance team and in that landscape. How can we make sure that we are holding ourselves as decision makers, as trustees, to account for staying at that appropriate level and making decisions which are really thinking about the organisation, not just today, but in the medium and in the very long term, so that we're setting ourselves up for success. So we found some really interesting feedback that came through this overall picture of organisations' level of confidence in their governance practices and processes. But one of the other things that we spotted, particularly through our quantitative side of our data, so particularly through those numerical scores, was that there is a degree to which there is misalignment between our governance teams. Now, what you can see here is a chart of the response levels for 3 different groups, which we considered when gathering this data. We had people who identified themselves as trustees. We had people who identified themselves as staff members. And then we have this category called other. And other typically would either be a trustee giving an additional description. So that might be a trustee who is also the chair of the board, a trustee who is also a treasurer. Or it might be someone else who is a governance volunteer. So at times when we do these exercises, we might involve subcommittee members, for example, but people who are voluntarily giving their time into governance rather than staff members. And what you'll note is that there is a significant gap between the perception and confidence of people who self-identified themselves as staff members compared to those governance volunteers, with staff members, broadly speaking, having a lower level of confidence in the quality of governance and decision making across these different areas. Now, while this is the overall picture, something else that we did spot was that where an organisation in general had a higher perception of the quality of their governance, we also saw that those organisations tended to be more aligned within their governance team. So where any given individual organisation of our 70 felt that they were scoring from competent to excellent, typically all parties who responded were quite well aligned with that. Whereas where organisations were scoring more in the getting a grip or below region, that was where we started to see this misalignment occur. And so that hopefully is a nice way to bring in my colleague Jesper from Zurich to talk about how this misalignment can be significant when we think about governance as a risk management discipline.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Jesper Glacius. I am a senior strategic risk consultant with Zurich Resilience Solutions even. And we work with organizations that are aligned to the Zurich insurance arm called ZM, Zurich Municipal, working with charitable organizations, social housing, local authorities, and educational organizations. So we meet organizations such as yours quite a lot, and we work with all levels to really understand where risk management can support reaching strategic objectives in an organization. And one of the key areas that we work with is what Sally brought up before, is that alignment of responsibilities. And that's sort of the first thing that I would like to bring out to look at. Is a way to look at it is often the theoretical basis is called 3 lines of defense. And that is the first one. And that's understanding where you sit as trustees. The first thing I should say is actually trustees and the board sits a little bit aside of these 3 lines, but what it does do, it illustrates an understanding of who you're talking to whenever you're presented with any piece of the governance procedures, especially regarding risk. So we've got the first line of defense, which should be staff at all levels, and that's where the risk management actually happens. So in this element, we actually want to see what is risk owners doing about risks. What is it that the management part is that we have on each risk? And that's probably a bit more both operational and strategic. As a board, that's where you really have to be aware of how detailed do you go into these risks. When you're having oversight of these, you should stay with looking at the process and having assurance that the actions taken are relevant and effective. The second line, that will be your experts. And I think that's probably where in charitable organizations, especially on the smaller ones, you probably won't have dedicated specialists as much as in other organizations. But it's important to think of that second line of defense as sort of the enablers. Those are all of the ones that put the processes in place and make sure that's the right knowledge in the organization, does training, and that should typically have oversight by senior leadership. Where it gets interesting for you is probably in that third line of defense. That's the oversight of that governance function. And it's about understanding and getting assurance that the processes work and that we are talking the same language, if you will, and that we accept that there are different responsibilities, not just in charitable organizations, but across all organizations we work with. The comment that was really prevalent in the report about knowing the responsibilities and having board members accept that they are not managing the minutiae, the details of each risk, but rather setting out the direction is probably the key element. And I think that's really where the differences come out, in the softer elements of governance. And what really stood out to me in the report I'm reading through is, I think the biggest differences, as Sally pointed out before, those 3 areas where there was the difference in perception between staff and trustees trustees, that's where we can really use training and awareness to bridge those gaps. Um, that's all about risk culture and making sure that we're all on the same page. So risk culture in the theoretical realm is the values, beliefs, knowledge, attitudes, and understanding of risk shared by a group of people with a common purpose. So obviously the first thing in this area is to make sure that as an organization, we agree on a common purpose. And then the second thing would be, what is our understanding of risk and where does it come from? Um, this is not just within leadership and trustees, it's also throughout the organization. And that requires a communication, both verbal and non-verbal, and setting the example of the right reactions. So what I'd like to do is just to sort of re-emphasize where was it that the biggest differences in perception were in that integrity, in board effectiveness, and in leadership. So when you've got staff that doesn't have the same beliefs or same understanding of risk and same understanding of how well are we managing our governance principles, there's probably a bit of a elements of that risk culture that is not permeating all the way through the organization. And we probably have a different perspective on how well things are going or how well things are managed. And I think that goes to both behavior and communication. And we see it a lot that there's always a point in the organization where someone says, actually, above this level, leadership doesn't actually know what we're doing, but we have a completely different perspective of how are things being done. So it's an alignment here where the behaviors and actions of leadership needs to align with what is being said. And I think I won't speak in too much detail on it, but this is probably the next example is probably just to sort of have an introspection of the organization of where do you see strengths in your organization and where do you see things that, oh, actually we could do better here. So from a trustee point of view, it's definitely the two top ones that I would focus on. Do we have a clarity of direction? Do we have a clarity and a purpose of what do we want out of risk and governance? And is that shared throughout the organization? The second one is always the key one. Are we responding to bad news? The report also talks about being a values-led organization. And that goes double for governance because you can have all of the talk in frameworks, in policies and communications of being a risk-based decision-making organization, of do no harm, of being proactive, but and also if it's in terms of risk appetite, that we have a certain way of working with risk and we want to seek out opportunities. But if there's the response to bad news is to assign blame or to scapegoat, then you're not going to get that governance with risk information flowing. You're not going to have accountability. You're not going to have staff who feel supported. So it's a top to bottom element of creating that risk culture. And I think when we work with organizations, that openness and willingness to take accountability, willingness to receive bad news, that is where you can really work to bridge those gaps in integrity and leadership and the feeling that both of those support the full organization and not just when it goes well. Finally, also that decision making and making informed risk decisions, that's where you sit. So if the response to bad news is not good, if that is not welcoming, and if it isn't a catalyst for transparency, you're not going to have the right information to make those appropriate risk-based decision making. So it's sort of that end-to-end piece of understanding that welcoming disclosure and having the right governance. It's about openness and transparency, not about necessarily looking good and looking like everything is under control, but rather it's about identifying places where things can go bad and identifying how we can manage that. And I think I often hear about risk averse organization and organizations that have a poor risk culture of staff hiding behind the parapets because the person who brings up a risk is typically the one blamed for it, whereas that just means that leadership doesn't get the information they need in a timely manner. So I think these 8 points is a really good way of improving board effectiveness and ensuring that the behaviors are conducive to a strong governance framework. Because in my mind, the key thing for that to work is to have the right information at the right time. And I think I will leave it at that because we're just past the half an hour. I will pass back to Sally.
Thanks, Jesper. What a great overview of the role that governance can play in thinking about, how we manage risk in our organization, but also the value of creating the right type of culture in terms of, how we manage that, and actually how, we see a risk appetite, I suppose, in a positive way, and move away from that sense of being risk averse, which I think can be very common in our organizations, that we're concerned about being risk averse. So this report that we've shared and looked into with you today reflects on the Charity Governance Code for 2020, or that was updated in 2020, and on exercises that we've supported in the years since then. But as I mentioned at the start of the call, we do have a new version of the Charity Governance Code as of last Friday. The code actually has not changed drastically. It has a slightly new format in terms of how the principles are set out. And you can see that on the Charity Governance Code website, and you can download a PDF version of the code now. The new format is that we have the principle in summary. So we have an explanation of what do we mean by the foundation principle, what do we mean by ethics and culture. Then 5 to 7 descriptors which set out what you can expect to see when it's working well. And these descriptors are intentionally broad and applicable to any charitable organisation of any size. Then, underpinning that core part of the code, we have a range of recommended practice which you might see in your organisation, including the types of behaviours that we expect the governance team to engage in, the types of policies, processes and practice that you might apply in your organisation, and the types of evidence and assurance that you might look to find to validate that you're meeting this area of governance. So while the code itself in its terms is reduced, we've looked to make it much more straightforward, accessible and easy to engage with for an organisation of any size, that recommended practice has been increased significantly. So you have multiple different ways of looking in your governance and thinking about whether or not you're meeting the types of practice we might expect to see. There's then lots of supporting resources available to download from the website and available to access from there. And in some cases, we also have additional areas of practice which apply to certain categories of organisation. So we're not expecting every single charity to meet practice that you would need to have an employed staff team for. So we set that slightly apart. If we'd expect something to be in place, but you need to have a staff team, if we'd expect something to be in place, but you need to be a membership organisation, for example. So we have certain areas of additional practice which will be relevant to you depending on your shape and your size. As we go forward, we are looking forward to using the new code as the basis for our ongoing assessments of charities in our consultancy. And to support that, we've already redesigned the governance wheel. So for those of you that are NCVO members, you can go to our website, you can download the wheel tool now, and that has been redesigned to apply to this new 2025 version of the Charity Governance Code. So we're looking forward to learning a huge amount more over the next 3 to 5 years as to how these governance trends change and differ as we move forward. So Thank you very much for listening to us both. We now have a really decent amount of time, probably about 20 minutes, to look at your questions. And I can see that lots of questions have come up here in the Q&A. So thank you for being so engaged and involved. There are quite a few which are slightly more practical. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by just giving a little bit of a practical summary, which I think will answer 3 or 4 of these questions all at once. And then I've got one already picked out that I'm going to hand straight to you, Jesper. So I won't keep you waiting too long. But from a practical perspective, just let me pick up on a few of the smaller points. Catherine's asked, how does the CGC, the Charity Governance Code, differ from the Charity Commission Code? There is no code that is set out by the Charity Commission. So the Charity Commission is our primary regulator for charities in England and Wales. They do encourage organisations to adopt a code of good governance, but they don't specify which one you should adopt. The Charity Governance Code is one of a range of codes that exists, but it is the only one that's designed broadly to apply to any charity in any sector. So we do have more specific codes in further education, in social housing, in a couple of other subsectors, but the Charity Governance Code applies to any charity. And the Charity Commission are not part of the steering group, but they do observe it. So while it's not a piece of law, it's not a requirement that you adopt the code, it is kind of endorsed by the Charity Commission, and they don't have their own version of it. The CGC is just endorsed by them. Someone else has asked, is it as applicable for not-for-profit organisations as for charities? And I would say yes, it is. There are some, small quirks in terms of language. So the code will typically refer to trustees, whereas you might more commonly refer to your board of directors. But most of the terms that are in there in terms of what good governance looks like are completely relevant to any not-for-profit organisation. And we have previously created versions of the wheel which have got the right kind of language to work for not-for-profit organisations that aren't charitable. So if that's something you're interested in, get in touch. A couple of people have asked things like, how can we actually make use of these tools and resources? The Charity Governance Code is freely available to any organisation, so it's just there on the website. The Governance Wheel is one of our member benefits. It's one of our tools and templates that you get through NCVO membership. If you're an NCVO member, you can go and download that right now. And that tool itself is in a PDF format. It gives you everything you need to undertake a self-assessment. So it has full guidance as to how to use the tool. It would take, for a self-assessment exercise, probably a couple of weeks. You would be looking for your participants, so whether that's your trustees, your senior team, senior volunteers if you don't have staff, to take some time to review the tool, answer the questions that it asks, which are kind of prompts for thinking, give yourself a score, and then some time for someone in your organisation to pull those scores together and look at what the overall picture is. So it probably takes a couple of weeks to do as a self-assessment. If you want to do it as a facilitated or supported assessment, so if you wanted to engage someone like me to walk through that with you, then usually we'd say that that's anywhere between a 5 to 8 day exercise with your organisation. And usually that will take more like a month and a half to do a basic assessment, including setting out a survey to collect the data, analysing it, and then playing it back to you. Or for a more in-depth assessment, we'd maybe go up to a 3-month engagement with you. So there are different levels that you can engage with these tools for, but they do exist as self-support tools. As a little bit about some of the points. Jesper, there's a really interesting question here, which is from Emma. Thank you for sharing this, which is that Emma's charity has 3 members of staff, so don't really have the 3 lines of defence, meaning trustees and managers have to work very closely on risk. Volunteers get involved too, but most of them aren't particularly interested in risk, sometimes not even their own health and safety. Have you got any thoughts on volunteers and how they're part of that kind of picture of risk management and risk culture?
Yeah, so I think that's where a lot of the communication comes in. For one, I think that the part about having 3 FTEs and the 3 lines of defense is a very good point. I think where that system can sort of work is sort of a check and balance type, where even though you don't have dedicated people as each of the lines, you can still think of it in those terms where you sort of you switch hats depending on where you sit. So you obviously still need that second line to provide your framework and say, okay, these are the parameters we work under, these are the tools that we use. Each of you will have risk ownership and be part of the daily risk management of it. But then on the third line of defense, you still need some of you to keep yourself honest and to have that sort of audit hat on and say, are we actually doing what we're saying we should be doing? So it just becomes a little bit more of a fluid working relationship without dedicated roles, but the the framework can still be used in that sense of having the three lines of defense in terms of that. In terms of, again, with volunteers and not being severely concerned with their own health and safety potentially, I think that's again that's a very operational thing, and it is a positive reinforcement of how we're doing things and why we're doing it. So with volunteers, it's obviously difficult because you don't usually get them to consistently do training or be part of the organization over time, or maybe there's a bigger turnover between who you have working with you. So it takes a lot of strain to make sure that everyone is trained and up to speed. But it is the consistency of what do we say we want and how do we then react when those things happen. So in terms of building a risk culture, it is that consistency of both communication and action that will help reinforce how that risk management should be done, especially as well on the operational part of health and safety.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. I think it's such an interesting question when we think about bringing volunteers into into our governance and how we make use of the kind of wider community, which is really relevant to a lot of our smaller organisations. I've got another question, which I think I'm going to bring you in for, Jesper, if that's all right, which is an attendee has shared that they govern in both charities and schools. And charities don't use governance professionals in the way schools are expected to. And this is a really interesting difference, I think, in the regulatory environment. So there are very specific requirements on schools and further education institutions as well to ensure that there is a qualified professional supporting governance. That's not a requirement by our regulator in the charity sector. And so charities don't necessarily have that person in post. This person says, when I joined a charity board last year, I had to really campaign to even get a minutes clerk, and they're a middle-sized local charity, because prior to that, the chair was taking the minutes. Do you have any thoughts on the value of having someone who has that governance professional skill as part of your governance structure, if you're of a size, obviously, to have someone in that position?
Yeah, I was going to say the first thing was again with the acknowledgement that some charitable organizations just don't have the size to have a person to be in that role, and we see that even working with local authorities, we see more and more of the slash roles. But where I see it as, and then obviously both Sally and I will go to bat for governance principles and having a way of having that oversight on your risks to be in place. I don't necessarily think that there needs to be a professionally qualified, certified person in place, but I think what's important is that you have a process in place, that you have a consideration of what you do, and I think that's where you sort of where you go from being an ad hoc manage things as they go wrong to someone who can to proactively manage risk and to avoid negative impacts in a structured manner. With finance being what finance is and being very much a limiter in all aspects, is always very hard to justify spending spending resource and spending limited resource on things that you can't evidence would happen if you didn't spend the money. So with risk management, what we always struggle with is to evidence the value, because you can't evidence the value of avoiding cost in a sense, because there's all theoretical. Um, but there are um, there is research done on the value of being proactive on risk management, and things like total cost of risk, and understanding that investment in risk management and governance ahead of negative impacts is less than allowing negative impacts to happen and then dealing with them, both in terms of business disruption, but also in terms of cost. So that's a long-winded way of saying you probably don't need necessarily to have that specified role, but having an agreed approach and an awareness of governance and risk management is a way of saving both disruption and resources in the long run.
Thank you.
Hopefully that answered.
Um, I used to be a head of governance in a large charity, and I think there's huge value if you are in the structure where you can have a governance professional. I think there is a lot of value in that, but there's realities to what our sector looks like and what our capacity is as organisations. And so I think putting into practice some of those principles that Jesper set out around creating that risk culture and the different lines of defence, they don't need to be completely couched in a single role. I've noticed that there are a number of comments very rightly asking if this is self-assessment, how realistic do we think that trustees and directors tend to be? And I think this is a really valid question, which I just want to address. The wheel as a tool is a self-perception exercise, and particularly when organisations use it without support, there's not really any way to govern how realistic respondents are. It is easier when we do it as a facilitated exercise, because we support organisations to make sure that they're kind of using it correctly. And if we spot responses which don't really align with the questions that we're asking, we'll kind of challenge that. So we have been able to be a little bit thoughtful in the data that we've used for this report. We were able to exclude certain exercises that we've undertaken where actually we found that the self-perception wasn't at all accurate to the organisation and would have significantly skewed the results. So we do feel confident that actually this data is pretty representative of the sector. And actually what you see therefore is that we do have this kind of average scoring come through. Someone else has asked, you mentioned respondents were confident about decision making, but the average isn't much higher than other aspects. And it's true. I mean, we are talking about quite small margins across the different scores. Our report has a really excellent methodology section as part of its appendix. So if you're into data, you can see where we've drawn some of these conclusions from, but we are talking relatively small margins. However, we do feel quite confident that because these were facilitated exercises, that they are quite accurate to the sector. We've got a couple more minutes for one or two more questions. And I think it would be good for us to pick up on some of the questions that are really around, so what do we do with some of these recommendations? Heather's asked, if boards staying strategic is a key governance opportunity, what are organisations who do this well doing differently? I've got a starting answer, and then Jesper, you might have something to add here as well. But I think where we see boards being really effective in their strategic thinking, they firstly have quite a clear sense of what their delegated authority looks like in the organisation. So what decisions they're retaining for themselves and what conversations they're choosing to have, versus what they're passing on to other parties in the organisation, whether that is their staff team, their volunteers, reaching out to their membership, moving into subcommittees, perhaps, if you've got a wider governance structure. And so by using all of the mechanisms available within the organisation, those boards are able to really focus on what are the key strategic drivers that they need to spend their time on, rather than getting stuck in the weeds of what might end up being more operational decisions. Yes, but have you seen any good examples of boards managing to stay at that strategic level?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it is just again coming back to that understanding roles and responsibilities, and I think it's about trust. That if you have staff that they can manage the day-to-day risk, but with the information as board members, as trustees, as senior leadership, you can then set out the direction of travel and say, actually, we can see these risks popping up and these risks that are coming on, but we can also see that and trust that they are being managed at the correct level and that they will be escalated for decision of perhaps stopping an activity or commencing an activity and continuing an activity, and keeping that decision level of what are we actually doing rather than managing the day-to-day risks. So the information should inform the strategic direction, not necessarily go in and be managed at the trustee level, if that makes sense.
Right, thank you. And then we have another question here, which again, I'm going to pass across to you, Jesper, first, which is one of our attendees has said that they chair a charity with £250,000 turnover, but have a detailed risk register. And they often get feedback from trustees that they are too risk focused or too risk averse. Any guidance on how to support trustees to value having a risk model? Should each major risk have a trustee assigned to give oversight, even if staff have direct responsibility? What would your thoughts be on helping trustees value a risk model?
I think as well, this is an interesting question, and I had my eye on it in the Q&A. In terms of having a lot of risk, meaning being risk adverse, I don't think that's true at all. It just means that you have the information in front of you. Because being risk adverse would be seeing the risk and then stopping the activity, or seeing that there could be risks involved and then stopping what you're doing because of it. But having a detailed risk register just means that senior leadership and trustees can make informed decisions. Um, if you take it to an extreme, as a risk consultant, I would say that having a detailed risk register, have a ready-made agenda for your board meetings. Should be the key elements that you need to discuss, and these are the key challenges that the organization could be facing. So I don't think you necessarily need to have a trustee for each risk. Um, I think also that you don't need to think that you're risk averse just because you have a detailed risk register. It just means that that is your way of working with risk, and it's a way of working that I fully support, and I hope that all organizations will take on.
Thanks very much. Um, We have another great question here, which I think picks up on one of those opportunities that we recognised through the report, which is from Annie. So thank you for sharing this, Annie. EDI at board level. Does anyone have any practical suggestions for how to ensure underrepresented groups can be encouraged or supported to become trustees? And Annie, this is absolutely not a question that I think we can answer here today, but it is a very active conversation in the sector, and something that you'll see on the agenda of so many sessions this Trustees Week. We recognise that there are some really structural barriers to becoming a trustee. It's actually very difficult to give your time and energy and enthusiasm if you are not a person who is already, has quite a lot of time available, that you can spend in whatever way you'd like. Often you also might need to be relatively well educated to have the confidence in your decision making. There are lots of factors which contribute to our boards looking fairly similar to one another. It is fundamentally easier to be a trustee in this country if you are older, white, well educated. And that does limit the scope for bringing in those diverse voices. I think the key things that we can do as organisations are we can try and make our trustee roles as accessible as possible. So thinking about what is the real time commitment needed, and is there any way that we can reduce that to make it more feasible for someone who might have caring responsibilities, someone who's in a full-time career, anything like that. Are there ways that you can support your trustees with things like their travel expenses? The ability to actually engage in decision-making meetings can be a real barrier. And if there are voices in your community that you really want to hear at board level, but you find it underrepresented in your trustees, do you have other mechanisms to hear those? Do you have advisory groups that you can reach out to? Do you have listening spaces where you can bring together those members of the community in a way that maybe isn't asking them to take on a full board position, but means that your board can still benefit from those viewpoints? Now, I will caveat that last bit by picking up on Simon's question, which is organisations which have a board of trustees and separate advisory council, which is a kind of older model for many charities that might have this wider advisory council and then a smaller board of trustees who don't really understand the interplay between their roles. How do you manage that tension? And the key thing is, if you're going to create any kind of advisory group, or if you have any kind of advisory group that already exists, but they don't have that decision-making power, this is where it comes back to this question of being very, very clear on roles and responsibilities, how we codify. I used this word codify earlier, and just to explain, that means how do we create a clearly defined structure for a role. So when people join that advisory group, do they have a set of terms of reference that say, this is your role and these are the things you can do, these are the things you can't, and here's your decision-making ability. Because if we don't have that clarity, that's where we then start to get those tensions emerging. So when you're looking to bring in those more diverse voices, amazing, but do make sure that if they're not going to be trustees, they're not going to be decision makers, that you've got a lot of clarity around that position. We have a few more questions that are here in the chat, but unfortunately we are towards the end of our time. So what we will aim to do is we'll aim to summarise any further responses to any of these last questions in our follow-up materials. You'll also be getting hold of all of our slides, plus all of the links that have been shared throughout the session today. So the final thing to share with you all really is to say thank you so much for being part of our session this morning, for asking some really fascinating questions, and for being so present with us as we've run through our governance trends report. We have plenty more things happening this Trustees Week, including a workshop for our NTVO members tomorrow on board behaviours, a session on Thursday all about AI and the essentials of how to use that as part of your governance. And we have an in-person networking session on Friday as well. You can find all of the information on all of those areas on our website. It has been a delight to share this time with you today. Thank you so much to my co-host Jesper for your expert insights and all of your responses to the great questions that we've had raised. And of course, thank you to all of you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.